Mark Weinberg, could you tell us a bit about your magazine in South Africa, the Alternative Left magazine?
Yes, the magazine's called Amandla, which was the kind of war cry of the liberation struggle. It means power.
Yeah.
And it comes from the slogan Amandla Wethu, power to the people.
Yeah.
So those that fought the liberation struggle in South Africa in the last 15 years have become very dispersed and disillusioned, and there's a whole new generation of militant youth that have very weak connections with one another and with the history and with the understanding of the world. So Amandla, the magazine, and all our other media projects have one purpose, which is to facilitate a broad, non-sectarian dialogue to enable a regroupment of political forces, progressive forces in the country.
How important do you see information as in the full scheme of activism?
I think information is an important element, but not the important element. I think there's a question about what we're after is behavior change.
Yeah.
For people to stop reproducing the status quo and to start reproducing a new reality by becoming active. Information has a role to play, how we develop a process where people transform that information into their own knowledge, and how they then transform that knowledge into behavior. How do they act on their knowledge? That's what we're after. So just sharing information is necessary but insufficient. Facilitating dialogues in which knowledge, people reflect on the information, reflect on their lived experience, and out of those dialogues develop knowledge.
Right.
And then looking at the kind of question of agency and organization, because it's often the knowledge that leads to the despair.
Yeah.
The belief that you see it and you can do nothing about it.
Yeah.
So
knowledge could lead to despair also.
In my experience.
I see.
Yeah.
You mentioned something about the community radio stations and the job they were doing in South Africa, which is impressive.
Yeah. Well, coming out of the anti-apartheid struggle, there was an alternative media component to that struggle, and one of the main things they campaigned for in the transition to democracy was the legalization of community radio.
Which were illegal in the initial stages and pirate and things like that.
They were born as pirate stations in the apartheid struggle. And obviously people went for community radio because of the high levels of illiteracy, because of the linguistic diversity of the country, and because there was a commitment to ordinary people owning and controlling the means of knowledge, information production. So on the eve of democracy, there's a legal framework which licenses community stations. There are now over 100 in the country, covering most rural areas and all urban townships.
And a listenership of?
A combined listenership of 7.2 million in a population of 48 million.
I see.
So combined, the biggest media, bigger than the state broadcaster.
I see. But what challenges are they facing in terms of content, in terms of generating content?
Well, with the virtual collapse of the liberation movement, with the kind of compromises that were made with the apartheid regime, there was a massive generational breakdown, a massive political and ideological hemorrhaging. So what happened is these stations were vacuums that were filled by youth that were aspirant to middle-class lifestyles. A typical station will play a lot of pop music a lot of the time. And then the legal model doesn't create any funding sources for these stations. They have to make a go of it on advertising. And what that means is they have to orientate themselves, their values, their content towards people with money. Now, in the rural areas, the only people with money are the state.
Yeah.
So government advertising, and it's really at the discretion of government bureaucrats then whether they'll
make or break a station.
Yeah. And you'll find a station that employs up to 30 people existing on one advertiser, the discretion of one bureaucrat.
I see.
So stations are very vulnerable and almost set up to respond to the mood of their communities. But when the communities are demobilized and in a survivalist mold, then the stations become an expression of that. They imitate the commercial stations playing music, sexist jokes.
I see.
That kind of stuff. So that's the terrain we work on, and it has its challenges.
So one last question: what's the point for optimism in South Africa? What do you see as something that could, change things for the better?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the human spirit. The fact that the current leaders of the country don't have alternatives to poverty. They create dreams and myths that you can get out of poverty, but after 15 years, there's been no significant redistribution of opportunities or assets. And my faith is in the people, that slowly that reality will translate into a new knowledge, a new understanding, and a new generation of activists.
Thanks so much, and all the best in your work.
Good. Thank you.